Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this last session of the summit. It's a real honor, and I think quite wise insight from the ABDI to actually convene such a panel at the summit where real macro and global issues are being discussed. But I think in the case of Ukraine, a lot of weaknesses of the global systems that we are discussing are evident, but also some hope, I should say, which is probably hard at the moment, is evident. And I think there's honestly no better place than Japan that is such a symbol of resilience, of reinvention of itself as the country, and also innovation. That is a good place to discuss and start a dialogue on Ukraine's recovery in Asia. There is a big war back to Europe, and that, of course, for full disclosure, I am from Ukraine originally. I've been living for the last 10 years in London, but my home and my family is Ukraine. It's something that is very close to my heart. The war is back, and the capital, Kyiv, today was bombarded again with over 20 ballistic missiles. And over the year of this invasion, Russia has launched 5,000 of those missiles. And what is so vicious is that these missiles are targeting actually civilians, high block buildings. 30% of Ukrainian energy grid was destroyed over winter on purpose in order to basically bring Ukraine to its knees, to freeze Ukrainian civilians in order to have Kyiv, in a way, submit to Putin's will. This war is causing horrific damage to fertile soil that is a grain basket of the world, and the size of the mine territory is now the size of United Kingdom. Think about it for a minute, what it will take to bring that fertile land back to feeding the world. And 14 million of displaced people, both internally, most of them actually, and externally, many in Europe. So why is it important for you and for all of us to focus on Ukraine reconstruction? There are so many global challenges that this was evident from our morning conversation. I mentioned food security, but I think Ukraine and the way we as partners engage with the recovery could be a really sandbox of innovation. It's rare, unfortunately, because of the tragedy, that at that scale of recovery that will be taking place, we could all benefit, profit, but learn from it. And I think there are a couple of questions that should be on our mind when we are thinking of Ukraine recovery. One, how can we learn to co-govern? Because our people, citizens, cities, communities, they want to be part of process, not just beneficiaries and customers. And two, how can we actually transform aid into foreign direct investments and private sector growth to create jobs and not to create another debt crisis in the middle of Europe? So all of these questions, I think, are fascinating, and I have an amazing panel with me today to discuss. Joining me from Kyiv and all of us is Anton Antonenko. Anton, good to see you now. I see you're with us. And I will introduce our panel in the order that they will be joining a conversation. Anton is the vice president of Dixie Group, a think tank in Ukraine focusing on energy, but also Dixie Group is a member of RISE Coalition, which is the group of 40 Ukrainian civil society organizations already thinking and planning Ukraine's recovery. Next to me is Mr. Matsunaga, who is Director General for the Middle East and Europe Department at the Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA. Welcome. I mean, you have an amazing experience in development, but what is quite interesting is that after the earthquake and tsunami in 2011, you led the team to actually call Japan Platform to coordinate the effort of reconstruction, and I think it's fascinating to hear from you. Next is Ambassador Dobransky, who is the former Under-Secretary of State for Global Affairs. She has a wealth of experience. I will not name all of that, but Eastern Europe is also very much close to her heart, as much as Asia, and because she's been involved with various dialogues and primarily between US and India, US and China, US and Brazil. So she has a real global outlook. And Paula is now a co-chair of the CSIS, Ukraine Economic Reconstruction Commission, that CSIS is kindly also supporting this panel today. And last but not least is Dr. Tsunami, who is the president of Sasakawa Peace Foundation, and also the T7 Japan Advisory Board member, a distinguished academic in the field of ocean policy research, but also space, and advisor to Japanese government. I think we'll hear a lot of excellent insights. So I'd like to start with Anton, and I hope his connection will be stable. So I'll ask a couple of questions, Anton, if you don't mind just answering them, 2-3 minutes, so that we have a conversation with you, and then I'll move to other panelists. But when you are based in Ukraine, you live in Ukraine, how would you describe the damage that is caused by Russian aggression? What does it mean for Ukrainian people?
Well, hello, and thank you very much for having me today. This is very important, to talk about the damage, because it's immense in the modern world. We couldn't think about that amount of damage a little more than a year ago, and it was just hard to imagine. But now we have the numbers year on year, February 24, 2023 to February 24, 2022, and the damage costs are 143, almost 144 billion US dollars. That is assessment based on the replacement cost. So a little over 37% of that are residential buildings. 25% are infrastructure. Loss of business assets is amounted to $11 billion. Education is 8.9, energy is 8.1. So these are great numbers, but they kind of, leave you without the actual feeling. And the actual feeling is that these numbers are multiplied by thousands of personal tragedies, businesses ruined, great ideas not implemented, and chances lost. And this is the cost. 4.5 hours ago, people died. People died next to Kiev, people died in Uman, and people died in Dnipro. This as people were sleeping in their beds. It was 4 a.m. in the morning. So the family, the young mother of 30 and the child of 3 years old died in Dnipro just 4 hours ago due to very precise, planned and targeted attack. I just want you to understand that people were attacked, planned by military weapon, by the cruise missiles. And this is what's happening in the modern world, and this is immense. But I also want to say that this war started way before 2022 and even way before 2014. We can trace it in energy where we are focused. So you can remember the oil production and transportation capture of Ukrainian industry by Russia before 2006. You can remember the gas wars of 2006-9 and onwards. You can also think about the occupation of coal production back in 2014, the occupation of the biggest European nuclear power plant just recently in Zaporizhia, next to Zaporizhia actually, and deliberate attacks on energy infrastructure with over 250 missiles aiming at Ukrainian energy infrastructure. That's just this winter, think about it, over just 3 months, a little bit more than 3 months, 250 missiles landed into the infrastructure facilities dealing with energy and actually making sure people have lights, people have water, heat supply, and so on and so forth. And these missiles, I also want you to understand that these missiles are the material factor, but if we think largely, the attack is on the whole world, not only Ukraine. Russia has for years inspired corruption, and use this situation to build dependencies in many countries around the globe. This is how it weaponized the energy sector, for example. And you also can see the signs of this in many other sectors. So the biggest challenges as we see them is to stop the aggressor and ensure that situation like this will never happen before, or never happen more.
Anton, it's a sad day. Like in Ukraine, people say that every day is the 24th of February. This is how the country feels. This is how it's almost like the life was put on pause by that all-out aggression that spiraled from the previous decade of coercion and pressures put on Ukraine to reject and to give up its dream. The dream of joining the European family of nations on this collaborative, human rights, good governance-based model. Obviously, Ukraine is not just frozen. Ukraine turns its anger into action. And maybe you can tell us a little bit how Ukraine copes, how its home front, economic home front, human home front sustains, because if you look at public opinion polling, 90% of Ukrainians are confident that they will be able to repel Russian aggression. They are not willing to concede territories in exchange of some kind of promise of peace, but they want peace like nobody else. And they do everything to protect their homes, to be able to sustain their life in Ukraine. So can you tell a little bit how that war economy works, and how can countries, G7, a global community help in that right direction for Ukraine to sustain and continue its fight?
Well, Ukraine fights, and this is the only way we have, because we have to win our peace. As I mentioned, the war hasn't started even in 2014, so we know for sure Russia is after all of it, so we don't have another choice than fight. If we don't fight, we lose immediately, and this is something that is clear as a day. So Ukraine has no other option than fight and operate and function at the same time, because Ukraine will lose if it stops either of both. If it stops fighting, it will lose. If it stops living economic life, it will lose again. So right now, Ukraine is preparing for the next winter season, and we have 6 months to go, actually trying to do our best to rebuild the energy system. Ukraine also is striving to rebuild homes that were damaged, and I mentioned the numbers. The biggest damages are homes. So we need our people back in order to kickstart the economy again, right? And we cannot do it without having people back. People will not come back unless they have homes, unless they have social infrastructure, and it is actually the chance for us. We've been talking about reforming Ukraine for ages. My organization was tracking how Ukraine delivers on its commitments and aspirations in European energy reforms, in energy security and things like that. Well, now is the chance to actually transform, to leapfrog to that situation where Ukraine is energy resilient, where Ukraine is part of the global economy as well as global security. So we would like to thank first and foremost to many countries around the globe, to Japan, to the US, to Poland, to many, many friends who are supporting Ukraine. And it is true that it is friendship, partnership, and support that helps us run and helps us fight to win the peace. But we also need more. We need the support to win the war, to win this peace. We need the support to rebuild physically, and to revive socially. So if we think about the G7, we need to think about the sanctions and confiscation of assets so we can start covering these immense losses we have. We need countries around the globe to stop buying Russian goods and services around the globe, and to do it fully, not to the extent, because we all see the reports that these gaps in sanctions, these gaps in confiscations, this not being ready to go full scale is actually what wins time for Russia as the aggressor to continue the war. So this is what helps continuing the war, because this fuels Russian economy. We also want the leadership role of the G7 in the first two items, but also in ensuring Ukraine's future as part of NATO. I think we need to also make this step and stop thinking about the potential danger of Ukraine joining NATO. We all saw it's not relevant anymore. So this fear is not relevant anymore. It materialized, and nevertheless, we are in the middle of the war, also in the middle of Europe. So this is the situation. We need to multiply the global trust in Ukraine, because although we're now 1 year past the war, we still need a lot of support, and we still believe the major things are in front of us. So in the days, weeks, and months to come, and in the war, and also started the full-scale rebuildment. We are rebuilding. We are doing emergency restoration, but many more of it has to come. Second of all, we need private investments. We need to fuel the economy. We need to ensure it runs smoothly, and we are securing our expenses. And we also desperately need knowledge, know-how, and people in terms of our capacity. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anton, and it's a perfect segue into bringing in Mr. Matsunaga from JICA in a way of giving us a little bit of an overview how you reacted from the first days of this full-scale invasion to address these needs in rebuilding physically and rebuilding socially, like Anton said.
Thank you very much, Arisia and Anton, for excellent introduction. And since Russian aggression started in last year, February, Japan and JICA has extended a massive support in response to this crisis. And as a matter of fact, the very next day of the invasion, we had an online meeting with the World Bank and came up to agree to provide a support on Ukrainian government budget. And the following week, we had a meeting with Prime Minister Shumihari and the Finance Minister Marchenko, what we can, help the Ukrainian government. And I myself traveled to Ukraine last December and this January and February. And other colleagues was there a couple weeks ago. So we try to be there every month. And we also send a couple of our colleagues on the ground as well to work longer period of time on the ground. And the important thing is to see the real situation and devastation on the ground, as well as communicate with the Ukrainian counterpart in person. So that really helps us a lot to understand the difficulties the Ukrainian people and the countries are facing. So based on that, the situation, JICA has set up a sort of a strategy to support this crisis in 3 reinforcing pillars. And the first pillar is to support the state function of the Ukrainian government. And as Anton mentioned about the country needs to fight and operate. Government really needs to pay the wages for the hospital workers, or pensions to elderly, or social security service to vulnerable people. So that's the one thing really the international community needs to support to get the government going. And the second pillar is to support displaced Ukrainian as well as a neighboring country who host them. And we especially focused on Moldova, and we have been providing some assistance on the health sector. And with Poland, we are working as a partner to enhance the capacity of the Ukrainian counterpart for demining as well as IT. So those are discussion. Third pillar is recovery and reconstruction. That's really quite a challenge, and for that activities we are right now doing a various thing, and we started preparatory activities through getting satellite imagery in order to assess the situation. It was before we could travel to Ukraine, but now since we do, we can see the devastation on the ground. But based on that assessment, we started a quick early recovery in a smaller scale. And the two bigger things I would like to mention is first is support to winterization. As Anton explained, many power-related infrastructure was damaged. So we have provided more than 300 generators and some heaters and some water compact unit as such. And the other activities we are deeply engaged in the demining. You mentioned, Orisia, that probably around 20 to 30% of the territory is unfortunately contaminated by mines, and it's going to take a long time, and the Ukrainian counterpart are trying their best to clear those mines from residential area or agricultural land, and that effort is ongoing. And we have undertaken some training courses in Cambodia, who has also suffered a lot from contamination by mines since 90s. And some Ukrainian counterpart traveled to Cambodia and Japan, and we also provided some equipment such as detector and some beagles, which might help their activities. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
That's very interesting. And what Anton said at the very end is about knowledge. And with your background, being part of Japan platform, where do you see JICA perhaps being a bit different from other G7 countries in how and what kind of recovery assistance Japan has, a niche to deliver, and what are some other perhaps partner organizations in Asia? Could you partner with some of them? Could Japan be any kind of in a cohort leading because you have perhaps more exposure in Ukraine, bringing some others like Cambodia you mentioned?
Thank you very much for that question. And maybe before I respond to that question, first of all, recovery or rebuilding should be done by the Ukrainian people, and ownership should be on the Ukrainian people's hand. So, we should not be really supply driven, and we should work based on the needs on the ground. So, difference of donor side is subtle compared with what's going on the ground, and we should always put the Ukrainian people in the center. But having said that, based on Japanese unique probably experience as well as expertise, building after World War II, our reconstruction experience after World War II itself, and as you might know, Japan has been affected by many natural disasters, and we have built some, own reconstruction experience, and that's really the one thing. And for example, we have developed some know-how and expertise on removing debris and rubbles, like March 11th, 2011, a great, northeast earthquake in Japan. There are massive debris and rubbles, piled up, and each municipality, as well as the private sector, has developed some expertise of clearing it. So I mentioned about mine, but in addition to mines, I think how to clear and manage those rubbles and debris, waste management is really the key. So we organized a full workshop along with connecting Japanese municipalities and as well as the Ukrainian municipality. And there are more than 300 participants for that seminars, trying to learn each other. So that's one unique experience. And another thing, if I may touch upon, is in January, there are some leaders from civil society visiting Japan. And I asked them what they would like to do over weekend. And they wanted to go Hiroshima, a day trip, even if it was day trip. And I was going to show them other touristic site, but they spent the whole day in, Peace Museum as well as a park, trying to learn what Japan has gone through after the attack in Hiroshima. And for Ukrainian people, it's not really somebody else, problem. In face with, this really the threat from the Russia, being mentioned about nuclear usage, it's not somebody else's problem, and they take it as their own problem. And such thing, our unique experience and expertise, something built, might be of some help to Ukrainian people. But in addition to that, as I mentioned, probably we should more mobilize other Asian counterparts, just like we did with Cambodia. And Japan is only an Asian G7 member, but it's not only G7 issue, it's a whole international community issue. And I think your point is quite right. We should be more proactive to engaging other Asian countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you very much for mentioning that ownership element. I've been studying Ukraine with Chatham House now for 10 years, and we've set up this Ukraine dedicated forum, which has actually quite a lot of materials about how Ukraine changed since the Revolution of Dignity and how vibrant civil society is, and what is most important, decentralization. The fact that you can now bring municipalities together, there is a real power. Of course, now during the martial law, it's a bit curbed, but the political system changed in Ukraine in the last 6 years, and there's a fiscal decentralization. People are empowered. People have agency to act, and public opinion again shows that I think it's 80% of Ukrainians want to take part in rebuilding, because being active gives you hope. Being inactive and being paralyzed makes you the victim. And I think it's a dark irony that the country that gave up nuclear weapons is now being threatened by nuclear weapons. And I think the world has to, put a stop to this nuclear blackmail. And I think something to keep in mind when the countries are talking about non-alignment or not taking sides, there should be a clear side. Its side is Ukraine. It's not about Russia and United States. I think it helps for all of us to take Ukraine front and central. And then I believe many choices are easier or more clear. Maybe not easier, but more clear. So thank you. We'll move around the panel because I also want to bring in the audience, make sure we have that time. And to Ambassador Dobransky, now that I mentioned United States, of course, clearly it's been the major contributor to Ukraine's security assistance to be able to now connect Anton from Kyiv when that Kyiv was under assault just a year ago, and nobody knew what would happen to the core of Ukrainian state. But also United States comes as a very active leader in Europe in the post-wars recoveries, and Marshall Plan comes to mind after the Second World War. There's been a recent book that was published that size on the history of Marshall Plan. Maybe benefiting from Ambassador presence here, she could give us the gist of it. What is the relevance of that Marshall Plan? Could it inform us something on maybe, guide us in structuring that recovery for Ukraine post-war? Paula.
Certainly. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And let me first thank the Asian Development Bank Institute for bringing us all together. And before I answer your question, I'm going to combine about the Marshall Plan and also what the U.S. is indeed doing with Ukraine. But I do want to mention the fact that we are in Tokyo. I have been personally very struck by Prime Minister Kishida's statements and speeches that he has delivered on Ukraine, looking at not only the political, military, security situation, but reconstruction in preparation for the G7. It's worth noting because he, in fact, has stated, and he did in a recent speech before at Johns Hopkins University, in which he stated that we've come to the end of the post-Cold War period, and he really underscored how what happens in Ukraine, and he meant not only in the context of the fighting, but also in the context of the aftermath in terms of recovery, that it has ramifications for this region. And I wanted to mention that because I think that's an important point to make, and especially because being here, I wanted to make it because we're taking great note of that over in Washington, D.C. So to answer your question, let me combine both the Marshall Plan and then with what we're doing into one. First, in terms of the Marshall Plan, is it relevant? The answer is yes. In general terms, Marshall Plan is relevant. Is it a specific model or blueprint for Ukraine? I don't think so. And the reason is, although there are some specifics and similarities of circumstances, there are also some very fundamental differences. It's worth noting that President Zelensky himself actually early on called for a Marshall Plan for Ukraine. But what did he mean? He meant a multilateral rebuilding. He didn't mean it in the sense of the actual Marshall Plan that was put into place after World War II. But what are some of the fundamental differences here that I think are worth noting? The fact is, the situation in Ukraine cannot really be compared to the aftermath of World War II in terms of the scale and the scope and across the board, the kind of devastation, but not just only that, the complexity of the situation itself. It's a very complex one. There aren't precise kinds of parallels here. It's also significant when you look at the figures. The World Bank actually has cited that Ukraine's reconstruction, they price it at some $540 billion. Well, when you look at what were the monies that were put in place for the Marshall Plan, well, by the way, it costs less than a third, if you can imagine, of that amount. And in fact, even when the National Council for the Recovery of Ukraine, actually from the consequences of war, they also put forward a figure of what it would be. Actually, they put it at, for damaged infrastructure, just damaged infrastructure, $140 billion. So that's one of the fundamental differences here. Secondly, it is worth noting a similarity. The Marshall Plan, as well as what's being focused on here for recovery, is very consequential in terms of the political outlook and attitudes. It will have, excuse me, a very positive one, as well as a very positive, if you will, psychological outlook by having this kind of a plan, blueprint for action, and this kind of support internationally. You can't imagine how important it was then and how crucial it is also now. There's also the need for private sector investment. That did not really loom large in the case of the post-World War II period. There's also the focus on transparency, corruption. As I mentioned, the complexity of the issues here that have to be addressed. And I think it's also worth noting, and I think, Orisha, you mentioned it, and also, if I may say, Matsunaka-san, you also said it, and as well as Anton, it's not just about restoring, what was lost, but it is actually looking at innovation, modernization, and opportunity for construction and going forward, and actually putting in place a different environment. Let me give just a few minutes on what is the U.S. doing then, in fact. Here, I put it in three primary categories. Just recently, this month, actually, there was a major conference that was hosted by the United States Chamber of Commerce. It was in that occasion where the U.S. government, with the various private sector organizations and with the business community, actually have launched what is known as the U.S.-Ukraine Partnership Forum. It's to bring together all of these parties to work together also with multilateral banks and institutions towards actually providing assistance to Ukraine in its recovery. Very significantly, I want to underscore also what you've said, the whole tone and tenor. You had the Commerce Secretary of the United States speaking, but you had the Prime Minister of Ukraine delivering a major speech at this forum, laying out what Ukraine wants for its recovery. What are the priorities? On my panel, we had the Ukrainian Minister of Finance, and he too described the specific priorities. As Anton mentioned, infrastructure, the importance of also a basic thing that we forget, housing. Why does housing matter? Because of bringing those who are abroad back into Ukraine. So this particular forum seeks to bring all of the donors, all of the partners together to basically look at what it is that Ukraine wants to put forward. Secondly, through the United States USAID, and also in working with the World Bank, the United States government has given funds both to our U.S. Agency for International Development to help Ukraine in very targeted projects, and also has given a significant amount of money to the World Bank. It's about some $18 billion to also support bank-related projects to work in tandem. And my last point on this, the third I want to mention, which hasn't been mentioned to date, the U.S. Biden administration just put forward a statement that it is also actively looking at the issue of Russian assets used for reparations. Some of you are familiar with this being integrated into the discussion. There was recently a General Assembly vote in which it was voted in favor of very strong support of using those assets and supporting Ukraine's recovery. And the U.S. government just issued a statement formally, the Biden administration, saying that this is a course and action to take.
That is a very right action to take, because why should international Western or Japanese taxpayers cover for this immense damage that is intentionally caused by Russia in this illegal, and I underline unprovoked, aggression as it has been voted by the United Nations. But maybe just before we carry on to some of the work that CSIS, the Commission, is doing as a way of informing our participants to that request of President Zelensky, there has been a multi-donor coordination platform that has been set up in the last G7 meeting that was outlining the needs for secretariats of such platform in Kyiv and in Brussels. So it includes G7 plus European Union, and I think it should be expanded. I mean, this is the ambition. What also is in place is a series of international conferences that started from Lugano last year, and they are now convening this year in London. So Ukraine Recovery Conference will take place from the 21st to the 22nd of June. That actually was renamed from Ukraine Reform Conference to Ukraine Recovery Conference, and many other initiatives, including setting up of Ukraine Reconstruction Agency inside Ukraine. So we already see an ecosystem of recovery shaping up. It's not fully yet ready, but it's shaping up. And here, Ambassador, I would like to ask you, you mentioned about the importance of the private sector. We are slowly moving to the private sector of that end of the panel, with the Sasakawa Peace Foundation also being with us. Where is it from your conversation, multiple workshops with the CSIS? What can private sector do already now? And what it brings to the table?
Well, let me try to give it very succinctly. First, the Center for Strategic and International Studies has set up a formal commission that does focus on Ukraine. The word reconstruction is used, but recovery. And it's the primary purpose of the commission is to focus on how and what role the private sector can indeed play in this process. It issued a report, and let me just give you a few of the highlights. I'll start with the broad point, which Anton, I want to underscore, you said, which was the very essence of the report. It said that we must begin now because it's not just winning the war, but it's winning the peace. And you can't begin later and wait, you have to begin now. So the essence was to have a report, but now it's very focused on implementation. The kinds of things that are put forward. One, create an enabling environment in Ukraine, in fact, which would be attractive to businesses and to private sector investment in Ukraine. And what does that mean? That means clearly transparency, rule of law, and not just on the books, but actual indications, clear indications that companies can feel very comfortable by coming in and engaging. And by the way, one word that is mentioned all the time in this capacity is insurance. You know, companies want to be certain that they have insurance. They have some protection against certain kinds of liabilities. Also, secondly, we urged the making of a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar commitment because the complexity and the scale and the scope of what's before us is in our interest. It's in the interest of stability, security, and also economically it makes sense, although it's expensive. Here it would involve the United States, the European Union, the G7 partners, and all the kinds of multilateral donors. Here also, thirdly, I will tell you, I've heard this over and over by Ukrainian officials. Recently, the mayor of Kiev came to Washington, D.C., and he talked about how recovery is key, and he used the term over and over, which was in our report, have a roadmap, that we need to have a precise roadmap and a roadmap that we stick to, and ensure that Ukraine does have a clear roadmap. They do. There's the National Recovery Plan, and especially as part of this process is the emphasis about the role of the EU. Clearly, President Zelensky has said very clearly, we want to be part of the EU. You've had different comments, including at this recent Chamber of Commerce meeting. We had a representative from the EU on our panel, and when asked the question, how fast will accession be? You know, it's ranged from longer term, but I have to say, I heard the shortest term, 10 years. That was at least the shortest I've heard to date. But one hopes that this kind of process can be expedited. Clearly here, the EU wants accountability, that Ukraine has to take reforms. It can't just go right into the EU without ensuring that it has accountability, inclusion for its citizens, strengthening of its judicial system, you know, and also this kind of decentralized government and freedom from corruption. Few other points. There is also the point about mitigating risk. I've already underscored that for private investors. Here, you know, there was a suggestion in the report about actually creating a pool of development funding from the United States, from what's called now our DFC, our Development Funding Corporation, the World Bank's IFC, and the EDFIs, amounting to $5 billion per year for 5 years, as I referenced. Three last, define roles and responsibilities for the development of agencies. Why is this important? We discussed and debated the issue of repetition, overlap. You know, if you have well-defined roles and responsibilities, you're not tripping over one another, and resources could end up being misused. Also, the issue of modernization, as I already mentioned. I think I'll end on this particular note because it is a key one. Here, it's not just about recovering what has been lost, but as has been stated, and I wholeheartedly support, as did this report, that it's an opportunity. And Ukrainian officials themselves say this over and over, for modernization, for freeing up of the kind of corruption, solidifying a rule of law system, and literally using technologies. There was the panel before about digitalization. Ukraine would like to have that more in place. I will also end on that note, but it's just again, it's just congratulations to the Institute for bringing us together. I think this discussion on Ukraine, it's been a priority for Japan, and that is very well commended and embraced by others around the globe taking note of that. Thank you.
So, Ambassador, you mentioned European Union integration, and Ukraine is EU candidate status, which is part of Ukraine's victory, if you want, agenda. I mean, Anton mentioned how EU integration has always been a pull for that modernization, but Ukraine really needs, double-digit growth in order to bring back its people, in order to, Ukraine has lost a third of its economy, and by becoming a part of that large market that could actually be a magnet for FDI, for placing manufacturing in Europe, for creating jobs and talent. So, and also that is combined with the NATO membership, and something that obviously security umbrella for post-war Ukraine is key. There will be no big investment if Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and again, Anton spoken to that. I want to underline it. There could be a temporary transitional solution for security, but all of us understand that this sustainable peace can only be with Ukraine integrated with the transatlantic security architecture. And now I'd like to bring in Dr. Tsunami, because he is one of the largest Japanese private foundations, and I think it's in the spirit of public-private partnerships that we will successfully rebuild Ukraine. It would be great to hear from you. How do you see that reconstruction can win that peace? You know, that Anton said, we are fighting for peace. And peace means, security. It means people being optimistic about their future, seeing future in Ukraine. You are supporting a lot of Ukrainian refugees here in Japan through your work, but also that human component of recovery. I know you have a couple of slides, so maybe you can walk us through the Sasakawa's journey towards Ukraine's recovery.
Thank you. It's kind of strange, or this is really unprecedented for me, the way coming here, just thinking of how we'll be discussing about reconstruction of Ukraine. Yet at the same time, I just heard the news that the bomb dropped in Kyiv a couple hours ago. And this is a real ongoing, struggle for human lives. We have to also same time thinking of how we're gonna work out this reconstruction plan and how we can work together in looking at future for Ukraine. But first, I think at most we need to find a way to stop killing on the ground. I mean, this is something that is very important. And I remember 2 years ago when Prime Minister Kishida it was inaugurated, and one of my close friends, the Prime Minister's office, we talked about possibility of hosting G7 and possibly in Hiroshima, where that's his hometown is. And but at that time, I couldn't imagine this Ukraine situation is going to be the top of the agenda for G7 Hiroshima, even including nuclear threats. We are talking about, we did discuss that Hiroshima summit will have some issues relating to the nuclear deterrence and other things. But, as we are preparing for the summit, the nuclear threat is real. And it's happening at the moment in Ukraine. So, I mean, this is, I don't know how to put it, but this is something it's ongoing things, but, very difficult for us to even concentrate on thinking of reconstruction plans and things. But yet, anyway, when the Ukraine 24th of February last year, the Japanese, one of our brother foundation, called Nippon Foundation, was one of the first private foundation in Japan to offer support for the evacuees from Ukraine to Japan. And even that case, Japan, I think Japan is a country that is not really have a lot in-depth experience of having evacuees in that scale coming to Japan at one time. And I think we have quickly established the support programs for Ukraine evacuees. But at that time, our plan was a short term. I mean, we thought this going to be a few months, maybe at the longest. But now, after a year passed, I was in a conversation with Ambassador of Ukraine here in Tokyo about extending not only the support programs, but also thinking about how we can support the students, the people to continue the education that are outside of their own countries. How can we offer some of the issues for the education support and that? I mean, this is a more midterm, long-term plan, which we have not anticipated. And the other thing that Nippon Foundation started to do right after the 24th February is the support for the people with disabilities in Ukraine to evacuate safely. And we partnered with various international organizations that we have been working on throughout the world on the issue of disabilities and inclusion program. And quickly, that turned out to be very effective. And as long as we learned it, the Ukraine had 2.7 million persons with the disabilities that are at the risk and needed to help for them to have safety in their lives. So this is something that we, from the beginning, we focused on this people with disabilities, and we are still working on. And so today in the discussion, as we are talking about reconstruction plan, and I wanted to offer some of the ideas from looking at our partners in Ukraine on disabilities in Ukraine. And now at the moment, we are working with the National Assembly of Persons with Disabilities of Ukraine, NAPD, which sort of represents the interest of people with disabilities for all regions of Ukraine. And it has members of 120 public organizations. And they have identified 6 key areas for inclusive recovery of Ukraine. I just wanted to quickly highlight those 6. I think that are very important. First, it is important to involve non-governmental organizations, including us, in making decisions of how to develop the programs to ensure the assessing the real overall needs and be more cost efficient to inject their expert opinions from the outset towards implementation. That would, with the experience of disabilities and that. And then the second point is about nearly 500,000 of dwelling units were completely destroyed, and another 1 million were damaged. So nearly to build modular towns are often not accessible for people with disabilities and other needs. And the construction of social housing that is physically accessible and affordable with the necessary subsidies is an option. So we have to look at that issue. And the third point is that during the war, over 1,200 healthcare facilities were destroyed. And we need, as we are thinking of rebuilding, constructing healthcare facilities, we also switch this focus on the people with disabilities. In fact, in Japan's case, for the Great Earthquake, and we are known that people with disabilities had maybe 2 or 3 times higher of a mortality rate than the average per person. And so they are in absolute needs of care under this emergency situation. And the fourth point is equally important for persons with disabilities and other people to benefit, older people to benefit from accessible transport infrastructure. So when we are helping the people with disabilities for evacuation, we had to hire a special ambulances and care people to get into the ground, on the ground, and safely bring those people with wheelchairs and others out to this is a very, need a special planning and care. And so this is, as we are thinking of rebuilding infrastructure and roads, this is a great opportunity to think about the people and the accessibility for the people with disabilities. And the fifth point, there are additional pressures on social protection systems. So the number of social workers are dropped due to the unsafe conditions. And we need to make sure that these people, that special caretakers, would come back under better conditions and so on and so forth, in order to provide a continued care for people with disabilities. And the last point is that most of the workforce that are lost because of this, and Nippon Foundation now, we are working very closely in order to increase the number of employment for the people with disabilities in general terms. But when we are thinking about reconstruction in Ukraine situation, we need a more special effort to focus on how these people who used to have some work positions, workplace for the people with disabilities to come back to the workforce. And I'm usually, during that process of reconstruction, there comes the last of the phase of getting their normal lives back. So these are kind of issues that we like to focus on and to continue to provide our knowledge and our experience with our partners in Ukraine to really address the issue of the people with disabilities. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think it's very much resonates with the demands within Ukraine in civil society about this inclusion and having a seat at the table from the very beginning of drafting reconstruction and recovery programs that include vulnerable groups, women, children, elderly, disability, but also mental health crisis that is looming. And the First Lady of Ukraine is very much at the forefront of trying to design the system of, healthcare workers, teachers who can help identify early trauma, PSTD, that not to mention the veterans that will have to be then be integrated back into the society. So maybe GI Bill or something like that, Ambassador, and like you had in America after the Second World War. That's, Ukraine has to be searching the globe and also is very open to partnerships. Ukraine, I was just telling about my last job in Ukraine was at the Open Ukraine Foundation, and that Ukraine is very open society with very vibrant civil society, but also very open to the world in terms of cooperation. So I really encourage think tanks, academia, and social service groups to engage with Ukraine. And I understand that we can now take some questions from the floor. If you could just raise your hands, introduce yourself. You know the spiel. We've been here for 2 days. So who would like to ask a question? It'd be easy if you address it to a speaker. Anton is still with us in Kyiv, so remember he's ready also to answer anything you would like to raise with him. Yes? Yes, please, gentlemen in here. And then we'll go to a gentleman in the back. But first here, please. Yeah, right here. If you can raise your hand so that the people with microphones could see you, because they don't know where to run. Yeah. Right.
So, Ettore Greco from the Institute of International Affairs in Rome. We should recognize that not all are convinced that G7 is, in general, the member states of the G7 are right in concentrating their resources and also political commitments to Ukraine, and also, of low-cost delivery of different forms of support, including military one. And so I would emphasize that this crisis has very far-reaching global repercussions that will continue, most probably. Second, there are at stake fundamental principles that are global ones. And I would say it is an important point that we are defending the security order in Europe, and without military support, most probably Russia would be able to make territorial gain and create a completely unbearable situation in Europe involving immediately many other countries. So there will be a very devastating situation. But that said, I would say that it's important to have perhaps to introduce a note of caution concerning the process of enlargement of Ukraine to both the EU and NATO, because this will take, in any case, several years, perhaps something also more than a decade, because we know that this process entails a big transformation, and you have emphasized indeed that this effort to reconstruct the country will involve an investment of large amount of money. And we know there are also problems of governance, etc. And in the case of NATO, you also mentioned the necessity to think about transitionary, at least, systems, because there is at the moment no consensus within NATO for this step, and it will be difficult to build this consensus in the future, although, of course, the key problem that need to be resolved is to give substantial and convincing security guarantees in a possible post-conflict situation in Ukraine.
Thank you very much. You could also comment or ask the question directly, but let's hear what's on your mind. Yes, please, over there. Just raise your hand so that the microphone, yeah, over there, yeah. Yeah. Because when you put it down, then they don't know who to give the floor. Yes, please.
Okay, yeah. I'm Chang Ho. Chang Ho Kim from Open Society Foundation East Asia program, and I'm in full support of the discussion today about the reconstruction of the Ukraine. But at the same time, more than nearly 1,000 companies from the G7 countries are still operating in Russia. So I'm just wants to know your view from any of the panelists or the moderator about how the G7 countries should react to their own businesses still operating in Russia. And I know that there has been an ongoing discussion about the complete export ban among the G7 countries, but I just want to know your take on this point. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes, please. Yes.
Thank you very much for your very insightful presentation. My name is Maria Kuroshima. I'm from Keio Research Institute at SFC. My question is related to reconstruction process or project in Ukraine. I assume a reconstruction project in Ukraine needs to collaborate many kinds of experts like security or health or finance or other economic issues, etc. Also, the current global issue we have discussed since yesterday here needs the similar collaboration as well. So I'd like to hear your experience. I'd be happy if you share your experience to the extent possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now I'll bring back to the panel, and I see Anton's hand over there. Anton, we'll start with you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to come very briefly on the first and perhaps second question as well. So I want to mention that we've just got the news that another kid died as a result of the morning attack here in Kyiv. So this is the price of time. And I want to underscore that many times time is felt and reacted to differently here in Ukraine rather than elsewhere. Because this is the asset, this is the resource we cannot spend freely. So the most tragic words of the past 15 years have been the door is open. These are the words that Ukraine heard from NATO. And I want to be very clearly, this is the position that must not be repeated ever again. This is the position that we cannot bear as the country, because it is saying basically nothing. What is the reason for the supporting countries to not grant Ukraine the EU membership and the NATO membership? The safety reasons, we don't have them anymore. The money reasons, well, we've been talking the past hour about the cost of reconstruction. Now, what's the benefit? The benefit is the program, because you don't think about any out of the blue program for reconstruction. It's in there. It's in Ukraine's accession agreement. It's in the security, is in NATO's accession agreement. Ukraine, I think, is out of the Soviet weapon. I'm not the military expert, but what we use is the most modern and best use of the NATO weapons, right? So what is another reason to say 10 years, to say 20 years? And these are the very frightening words, trust me. This might be, and I understand that might be felt differently over the oceans, but there is no whatsoever reason to not have this framework very clear, very natural. And we're talking about the country that is not come on the radars of the global community in 2022, right? Ukraine has been doing cooperation. Ukraine has been doing integration processes for decades now, both EU and NATO. And we all, let me just finish with a small example. Just hours before the full-scale invasion, back in 2022, Ukraine started the electricity connection process to the continental European system, ENTSO-E. We've been doing this process for over 10 years by that time. We've been told it's impossible to connect earlier than another year. So in order to pursue with the process, we had to disconnect our electricity system from those of Russia and Belarus, and to work in the so-called isolated mode for 3 days. We disconnected just hours before Russia attacked, and we worked in the isolated mode for 3 months. And this is the difference. And Ukraine got connected to the ENTSO-E, nothing tragical happened, and this is their cooperation that was well prepared and well timed. So let me finish by saying time is the most important resource and asset, time and people. We don't want to lose both. Thank you.
Thanks, Anton, for this message of urgency, and I hope that it really resonates with the audience. Especially, Ukraine has also had a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the European Union. That European Union, is an unprecedented depth of interoperability and integration within the market for standards, from phytosanitary to anti-corruption agencies. So Ukraine is not starting from the blank sheet. Ambassador.
Thank you. I wanted to comment on the first 2 questions raised, and I'm sorry I did not catch your question when you said about sharing experiences. So maybe the other panelists did. But briefly on the other 2, I think you're quite right in mentioning the impact on and the attack on the international order as we know it. I think clearly both Russia and China have been very united in several ways. One, because they're very desirous of trying to go after U.S. influence internationally. And part of that is also the revision, if you will, of the international order. But it's also fragmenting our alliances, our partnerships. That's why I also, in my own remarks, did begin with citing what Prime Minister Kishida has been speaking about. He said this is the end of the post-Cold War period. We're into a new phase. And that part of that phase is attacking the international order as we know it. I'm also very struck by the fact that countries like Japan heretofore had not put significant investments in defense and now are doing that. It is a changed period in which we're faced with and confronting. And Russia's blatant and brutal invasion of Ukraine underscores it. But that's why I also have to say, secondly, personally, I agree with Anton's points. Regarding the EU, as you, Orisha, already pointed out, yes, Ukraine already, they signed immediately a kind of an affiliation, but the point is the value has to be for them being brought in. And as Anton mentioned, and I do agree with, why NATO and NATO now? The fact is that, you need security guarantees. Think about it. Even, let's say, Ukraine succeeds and wins this war, it needs security guarantees for the future. How does one provide those kinds of security guarantees, which would be necessary and crucial for deterring any kind of future aggression, and not just only deterring future aggression, but also ensuring that, if you will, peace and stability is in fact maintained. If you had asked me if I had thought Finland or Sweden would be brought in, quite honestly, no, not in my lifetime, and probably if we had debated or discussed it, but these were forcing events. I mean, truly, this blatant aggression. So that's why I think there's strong justification for looking at and having Ukraine in NATO. On the question of the G7, businesses operating in Russia, that's what I heard you ask. There was, for US companies, a very sizable number that left Russia. But at the same time, there have been some, I don't know what that precise figure is, that are still there. I will say that it's not looked upon favorably. And the reason why is because particularly if you look at certain sectors, well, they're providing income, and that income fuels Russia's continued aggression in Ukraine. I know that on the energy debate, there was especially great concern about those countries that are still engaging with Russia in the energy space. It's one of their primary sources of income. That's why Russia had to turn to China because of the demise of Nord Stream 2. And the view, finally, in Europe that there's a weaponization of energy, and they were looking for now greater diversification of energy sources. So my answer to you is twofold. One, I think it's unfortunate because such income provides a base for fueling the really inhuman aggression in Ukraine. And then at the same time, it also reminds me, when we go forward, how important sanctions are. And people forget about that. We're very focused on the war on the ground. We're focused also on recovery, but sanctions have to remain in place as far as I'm concerned.
Just before we invite to comment on the expertise and the question where there could be an exchange and some twinning, maybe using the EU slang here. I think it's key to remember that in a way, I think for the companies, and something that also connects to the green agenda, it's this ESG, 3 letters, where companies say they will do it, but sometimes they're just, greenwashing either their reputations, and they are not really delivering. In a similar way, today we are facing where companies will be asked both on the human rights agenda and now the operating in Russia, and who knows what's going to happen with China, will be a question of responsibility of private corporate sector for the global order. They are as an important stakeholder in that new age that is arriving as governments, as civil society, as municipalities. Companies will not be able to protect behind the shield and say, we're just here for our shareholders. I think those companies will not be very successful in that new era. So I invite them to pioneer a new approaches that includes Russia and includes China. Maybe now we will turn to you and then to Dr. Tsunami on the expertise. Mr. Matsunaga.
Okay, thank you. If I catch it right, expertise mobilization, I think third question is, and before the invasion, JICA used to dispatch, certain expert on certain field. Like, for example, one of the serious issue in Ukraine is really the domestic banks' bad debt. There are lots of non-performing loans, which Japan also experienced after the 1990 or 1991, after so-called bubble burst. And so Japan has gone through the process of reducing the non-performing loan, and many private banks went bankrupt. And so based on that lessons, we have been working with the Ukrainian government on that matter. And after the invasion, we still continue dispatching, mobilizing some subject matter expert. Having said that, I think Ukrainian people within the country has lots of experts and capable people. So the most important part is really to work together while mobilizing some external expertise with domestic people and domestic capable people. And especially when I travel to Ukraine and meet government senior officials such as ministers, deputy ministers, President Zelensky is 45 years old. And most of the ministers and the deputy ministers in their 30s and 40s. And it's really surprising, how dynamic and capable they are. And so I think we really have to look at that both ways, what is really necessary, but at the same time, what is there within the country. Thank you.
Dr. Tsunami.
Yes, I just wanted to sort of echo what Mr. Matsunaga just mentioned. I think it is very important to network and work with the people in Ukraine. And I remember having, during the conversation with Ambassador Kolinsky, which is Ukrainian ambassador here, he has suggested that he would introduce us a number of organizations and think tanks in Ukraine could work together with our efforts and our programs. And that sort of the networking and conversation is absolutely necessary even and today's world, I mean, we, because of the COVID, we're now used to doing everything online, necessary. And of course, Anton is joining from QEs, and this is precisely what we have to take advantage of. And sharing experiences, our experts outside of, maybe outside of EU or Japan, including people from Asia, I guess, and Africa. So I think this is something that I think is worthwhile trying. Thank you.
I think, knowing and understanding Ukraine after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine was very much westward oriented. That was the magnet. That was the aspiration. Ukrainians studied in US universities, in European universities. But I think with this aggression, Ukraine understands the importance of wider world, the importance of Africa, the importance of Asia, and shortcomings in Ukraine's, public diplomacy, in business relations, in diplomacy are now evident, because I think Russia is able to push its narrative about this war because people don't know Ukraine. I mean, many Europeans still, for many, it's still a black hole, not to say for somebody in Indonesia or in South Africa, but I think that gives an upper hand to the aggressor. And I think having more of these direct contacts, meeting Ukrainian people, will change that. But of course, time is short, like Anton said, and we should really think how we can mobilize now to come to Ukraine's rescue, because it will be cheaper if we do it now than if we postpone time. It will be a loss of life and loss of loss of, a lot of assets. So we still have time for a couple of questions. I wonder if there's anybody in the room who would like to address the audience. Do we see any hands? Yes,
May I just,
yeah.
while someone's getting the mic there,
Yes.
I just wanted to add a footnote to what you said. Something that really struck me last year when Ukraine was invaded, and I say this very fast, was the fact that Zelensky actually, I went to many conferences around the globe, and there was Zelensky on the screen. I think it was really incredible that Ukraine also realized the importance of these connections and making the case beyond Europe. And I think it's really made a difference. I just wanted to add that to what you just said.
That's important because I think one of the key questions we as a global community have to think, what do we learn from this invasion to prevent other aggressions, other use of force in foreign affairs, in territorial change, and how do we actually bring the imperial era to an end? Because European continent is a very much post-imperial society. It's coming to its terms. It still has to do a lot of reckoning, but countries like Russia are trying to bring us all back to the colonial imperialism that is something that Ukraine rejects and rejected, very bravely. So I think that is something to keep in mind. The gentleman, yes, here with the microphone. And if there are any more hands from this side, I don't see in the back. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up to the remarks by Undersecretary Dobriansky about this energy sector and Russia. And of course, this G20 is now taking place in India this September. And you mentioned China, but also India seems to be playing a role in this energy trade issues as well. And I just wonder whether the United States has any plan or strategy to address these issues toward G20 India this September.
You, Ambassador.
I'd be glad to. I was just in India last month, actually, and we were discussing India's position relative to Ukraine. And I might just add, you know that India is upped its level of oil that it's getting from Russia. But I don't know if you know another point. Actually, Russia is the #1 arms supplier or weapons supplier, actually, to India. The United States is second, Israel is third. So where does India fit? The United States has a strategic partnership with India, and there are many areas in which we collaborate. And thinking again, because I'm in Tokyo, we collaborate on the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which India, Japan, United States, and Australia were all members, and we have a military exercise, the Malabar exercises, as it's known. But to answer your question, what leverage we have, I think my own view is I think the United States has to modify its energy policy because we do have energy sources, but they've been curtailed for a whole variety of reasons. In the case with Europe, I know that the Poles have sought from us LNG shipments. We've had 1 or 2 shipments, but that's not the norm. There are constraints and barriers imposed to exports. So my answer is twofold. There are some who first initially said, well, should we take some punitive measures against India? I don't know if I fit in that category. I don't think so, because I think there are other options of providing India with the kinds of resources that it needs. And I think we've seen, like in the area of defense, that the United States was actually much lower in the scale, and now we're #2. So that's the leverage that we have. But in this case, this is where it comes to countries that are dependent on Russia or others, and how do you deal with it? It's like the question a little bit before about those businesses that are operating within Russia. So again, my simple answer is, particularly on energy, there are other options. There needs to be a change of our energy policy in order to help countries like India. And by the way, that was the same when India was also relying on Iran for energy sources.
Yes, so maybe, yes. And then I would like to also bring Anton, because energy is his daily bread. So how does that look from, Ukraine's sanction agenda, that talks about secondary sanctions? What is the message to India and other G20 countries? Because I think the kind of pipeline of income, it fuels aggression, like you were saying it previously. And then we'll go to Dr. Tsunami.
Thank you very much. Well, when the full-scale aggression started, Russia was making around 1 billion a day selling its energy resources. Now the situation is different, and it is capable of selling much less, and the world is going to energy transition. But I must say that our enemy is also, half-hearted decisions, if I may non-diplomatically call them. This is the sanctions that are leaving space to avoid them. These are the confiscation efforts that are lasting long, and totally understandable why. I mean, this is unprecedented challenge, both legally and physically, but sometimes it reminds me of, fighting a criminal being a university academic, right? We have to fight by rules, and they don't have whatsoever. Russia is still making money on energy. We all know how, we all know why, but we are still looking at the situation. The group in Ukraine that is dealing with sanctions and this proposing sanctions just issued the second report offering a number of tweaks to sanctions, like additionally taxing the companies that are still working in Russia and sending the money back to Ukraine for reconstruction, like doing special visas for Russian citizens trying to travel abroad, and again sending money for reconstruction. I'm sure globally we can come up with effective solutions, and they are on the table, to make Russia stop the war. But we are hesitant because we haven't seen anything like this. These actions were all in theory, and we all are in fear of what they can cause. And that's why the war is ongoing still. So with all due respect and all due appreciation of the world doing, I fully understand the fear, but I'm afraid that in my turn, that being hesitant about doing full scale is worse than taking this risk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anton. Dr. Tsunami.
Yes, okay, I just quickly wanted to mention that we pay India very serious, the importance of India, and of course, the Prime Minister Modi is coming to Hiroshima to join the G7. So I think, and also people in Japan sort of missed this, that last time the Prime Minister Kishida was in Delhi, he deliberately opened the Japan's strategy for free and open Indo-Pacific with India. And it's just that he sneaked out of the conference and went to Ukraine secretly. So the news went there instead of really focusing on how India and Japan would commit on our FOIP strategy. So I just want to mention that.
I'm just going to give 30 seconds.
Yeah, and then
just very 30 seconds. Anton, I agree with your point. In the earlier question, I mentioned the importance of sanctions, and you're right, our sanctions could indeed be stronger and more impactful and targeted. For example, there's the debate in the United States about the sanctions on the banks, and why not have it against the Russian central bank? So we could go on about the sanctions, but the question was about India. And on this question about secondary sanctions, many don't go in that direction because it is a strategic partner, but especially because there are supplies that could be given to India There is a positive solution here if U.S. energy policy was changed to permit, greater energy sources exported abroad. That's the simple answer to it.
Please here, the microphone. Yes, the first row. Yes, the gentleman.
Thank you very much. I speak as the T20 chair for India, but also as a former ambassador to Japan until quite recently, and as the Director General of India's largest think tank in the defense and national security space. So let me begin by saying that both the relationship with Japan and with the United States of America for India is extremely important. It's a strategic partnership valued by all sides. The oil part that you mentioned is really because oil is truly a fungible product, and we have seen how European countries have been also buying oil from Russia and trying their best to see if there are alternative sources. India is not the only one in this space. India's first responsibility is towards its people, to get them a secure future, to grow as well, for we do belong to the global south, even if we have emerged as the fastest growing large economy in the world. So having said that, let me quickly point out that, in fact, that's a question. How would you see Japan's continuing participation in Sakhalin-1 and 2, notwithstanding Japan's opposition to the Russian war in Ukraine? And especially because for Sakhalin-2, an exception has been made for Japan to continue to source oil and gas products. In fact, if you look at the statistics, the imports of gas in 2022 went up by almost 8.8%, Japan's imports of gas from Russia while the war was on. And it's also very clear that almost 9.5% of Japan's imports of such products during 2022, while the war was on, came from Russia. So this will help you to understand that, the world of oil and gas, as also arms, for instance, arms are also fungible. They are sold to all sides, as you know. So the fungibility of oil and arms is sometimes a little difficult for people to understand. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know who would be able to comment on Japan's engagement in these projects. Yes. Well, we don't have the proper expertise on the panel, as it turns out, to answer that question. But it's a fair point that it's such an intertwined world and trade routes.
I'll just quickly. I'm not as in a government, but the reaction to Russia's invasion, this time Ukraine, and also the past Russia's invasion on Crimea is very different from Japan's standpoint. This time, Japan joined the world in denouncing the the aggression of Russia. Not unlike the last time, because of our relationship with Russia is very complicated, but this time the government is taking a very clear position on this. So I think the project is even still hold at the moment. So.
Thank you very much. I think we are running out of time, and you can see what a fascinating. Yeah, Anton, you would like to.
If I may, just a quick word on this. That very much reminds me about the Nord Stream 2 discussion. People were saying it is business, but it turned out to be not. And in the end of the day, we all know what happened to Nord Stream 2. It stopped eventually. Now, if we speak about the oil shipments, and I will not attribute to countries, but you must understand, these sometimes are shipments that include transferring oil in the sea, bringing oil by the ships that don't have the devices, the transponders, so we call that a shadowy fleet. Basically, in a nutshell, sometimes it resembles something that pirates do, and the fleet that hunts against the pirates must hunt this shadow fleet. Yeah. Thank you.
That's a very important clarification that speaks actually also to a question of sanction implementation and governance, and what kind of institutions could and should be set up to actually, on one hand, enforce and monitor sanctions. Should it be done at the G7 level? Should it be done at G20 level? Because whether we want it or not, sanctions are becoming a daily operation of foreign policy and part of enforcement of some kind of rule-based order. And I would like to finish here, because we are running out of time, just to say that pretty much it's up to us. It's up to what we do today, whether this new age and new era that is arriving will spiral from fragmentation into chaos, or whether we will be able to restore some kind of a sense and that much needed collaboration that we talked about, whether gender inclusion into the workforce, or green transition, or digitalization. I think this is the moment of truth and reckoning for the global society. So I would like to really thank Tatsushi and the ADBI Institute. I do hope that you carry on research on the reconstruction of Ukraine and share with the expertise. We are here at Chatham House, and I'm also inviting you to tune into the 20th of June. There will be an online streaming of Ukraine Recovery Conference out of London, and maybe some of you will come to an official discussion in the city that Rishi Sunak and President Zelensky are convening. But first of all, I'd like to thank all of the panels for taking time to prepare and attend and fly all the way from Washington to Tokyo for the conference, and also you for staying with us the last panel and asking so many questions. Please join me in the round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.